Hello and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Contented Narrative. We will be looking at The Keep. Now, it was written by F. Paul Wilson and published in 1981. It was then adapted to screen in 1983. And this one was actually requested by a friend of mine called Jared. He has been on at me for a while to do this one, so I apologise, Jared. Here it is finally in October month. We'll be looking at three things as we always do. We'll be looking at how good is the book, how good is the film, and how well does the film take from the book. So first things first, the film. Now this film took me, well, I say me, ages to find. Jared found it because for some reason, like, the director seems to be like halting like production of this film, as it were. I mean, yeah, it came out in 1983, but it's very, very hard to get a copy of this film. So I had to borrow Jared's copy to be able to do this book to film adaptation. The director, Michael Mann, seems to just not appreciate this film whatsoever. He's just not very happy. It could be due to the fact that there was a lot of studio interference with it, so it's not the film that he wanted, or that unfortunately the final scene that they were going to get in the film, you know, the big battle between chaos and good and evil and all of that, wasn't able to go ahead because unfortunately their special effects person had passed away, and back then you only really had one or two people in the industry that could really do special effects the way that they wanted and to a high standard. Because when you're watching it, it is a good film, but when you're watching it, you can kind of tell that it had studio interference, because there are points where it's about to go down a road and you think, oh, okay, this is where it's going, and then it just jumps for no apparent reason whatsoever. Now, it's set in World War II, it's set with Nazis. Obviously, you can't have World War II without Nazis. Taking over a keep. Well, actually, technically, it's the German army, first of all, that take over the keep, and then they call in reinforcements from the SS. So you do end up with the Nazis. But they take over a keep, and then they accidentally awaken something from the bowels of the earth. Now, in the film, it's like a golem kind of thing, you know, like in Jewish folklore, something that you could bring to life through like mud and things like that. I don't know too much about it, so I apologise if I've offended anybody, but that's sort of my basic understanding. And this golem ends up killing off the soldiers one by one, and then just kills them all sort of towards the end of it. I wasn't bored watching it, but I probably wouldn't watch it again. It was a good film, and I wasn't bored watching it, but it's not one that I'd go, oh, do you know what I really fancy? I really fancy popping on the keep. I mean, some scenes did feel a bit surreal watching it. That I sort of felt like what he was going for and what he ended up with wasn't potentially what he thought would transfer well onto the screen. But overall, it gets a 6 out of 10 for me. It's not a bad film. It's a film of its time, and as I said, I wasn't bored. I enjoyed it, and at the end of it, I was like, oh, that was actually a pretty good film. Now, the book. Now, oh, I enjoyed this book. This book, I literally, as soon as you pick it up and start reading it, the way it's written, it's not in a particularly complicated style. It's not a complicated plot. The characters are quite straightforward. It's written so well that you don't realise you've read like 3-4 chapters by the time you've actually sort of like read 3-4 chapters. But what I love in it is it's the whole. So the creature in the book is not a golem. The creature in the book isn't even a vampire, but that's what it pretends to be. It pretends to be a vampire. What it actually is like an agent of chaos, of evil, of darkness. And then our other character, Glenn, is an agent of good and light and happiness. But it's really interesting to see how firsthand, how even though you know that something is evil, how easy it is to corrupt a soul that is considered good through good intention. So our main guy, the professor, obviously he is a Jew, so he is seeing firsthand what is happening, and he's friends with Romanians, Romanian gypsies, and he's seeing firsthand what's happening to them and their culture. So he starts an alliance with this creature, believing that this creature has his intentions at heart, and so he's basically going with an evil to get rid of an evil. And he's justifying it in his head that actually, you know, how is this any worse than what Hitler's doing at the moment? So it's very interesting to watch how he's slowly being corrupted to the point where he doesn't understand what he's doing. And even though Magda, who's his daughter, comes up and is just like, this is wrong, this should not be happening, her father still turns around and goes, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Evil needs to be evil. Then you're like, okay. The characters are so well rounded though as well, and although the main villain comes across as vampiric, as I said, that's not what he is. But he plays very well on it as well, because there's a section in the book where he pretends to be scared of crosses, because he knows that the professor is Jewish. So he wants the professor to start doubting his own faith. So he pretends to be scared of crosses, but not scared of any kind of incantation that the professor is putting across from his own faith. And it's very interesting to read about, because you then see this sort of like decline of the professor going, well, obviously is our faith right? Because obviously this thing is scared of crosses, and when they mention Jesus' name, he pretends to recall. But in actuality, this creature doesn't care about anybody. He is literally just he's just darkness personified. He's not a vampire or anything like that. And if he got out, he would take over the world essentially. It's so well written. Honestly, I could keep going back to this book. I've read it twice already, but I could easily go back to this book again. And this book gets an 8 out of 10 for me. I would definitely 100% recommend it. It is a very good book, very well written. And honestly, I mean, I loved it. I know Jared isn't a huge fan of the book, and he really loves the film. And for me, I love the book, and the film's okay. But as he says, you've got book narrative and you've got film narrative, and that's the whole reason why I started this channel. So overall, let's have a look at the plot. Now, the book starts with Kampfer, who's with the SS, hearing of the issues at the keep with the German soldiers and being assigned there to sort it out. Now, he's quite high up in the SS and he wants to keep moving higher. And then we learn that Vermin and his men are being picked off one by one. The film starts with Vermin and his detachment driving into the keep. So we don't get any sort of like of this pretense, if it makes sense. We just jump straight in from the beginning. But then we get Vermin in the book now going into the Dinu Pass in Romania, because he's been tasked with keeping hold of this keep. In both, when they first arrive, Vermin goes in alone. He notices the many unusual crosses that line the keep, and it kind of gives him a little bit of a chill down his back. But there's not an undue atmosphere. It's more that he's like, oh, it's a bit strange. The atmosphere comes later. So he's then told about the unusualness of the keep by the mason and his son, who are paid to keep it up to date and looked after. And now no one stays more than a night due to an atmosphere in it and the fact that they get really bad dreams. And when being given a tour by the mason, they come across a soldier trying to remove a cross, which scares the mason, as nothing should be disturbing the crosses whatsoever. So then in both... So then obviously Vermin gives the private, whose name is Lutz, a dress down and be like, you shouldn't be doing this. You've been given extra guard duty. So in both, Lutz then goes off on his guard duty in the evening and sees another cross, but this one's different to the other ones around the keep. So tries to remove it and enables the help of Otto. And they try to remove this cross because they believe it to be a precious metal. But when they burrow deeper, Lutz is killed because the creature is released. Now, as I said, in the book, it is a chaos of evil that comes across as vampiric. And in the film, it's a golem. So I'm just going to refer to it as a creature throughout the narrative, as it were. So in both, this then awakens the red-headed man who's in another country, who begins his journey to the keep to deal with this. Now, we get in the book a bit about Magda and her father, and how Magda seems to have feelings about events that happen. She seems to have like a sensitive side to her, as it were. And we also get more about the deaths of Vermin's men and the atmosphere that's taken over the keep and how it's building. But in the film, it just jumps into Vermin finding out a fifth man has died, and Kampfer with his SS troops coming in to assist them. But in the book, we get to see more of the unnamed man's journey, the red-headed man, who we then find out is Glenn. So I'm just going to refer to him as Glenn now. And more of Magda and her dad's home life. So obviously you can't have everything in the film. And as I said, I think there was a lot of studio interference. So I think these things might have featured, but obviously they didn't. So in the book, we get a lot more insight to the characters. So in both, when Kampfer and his SS arrive, he takes hostages from the local village so that it will stop the person that he believes is killing. Now, Vermin isn't sure that it is a person, and he doesn't believe it's a person whatsoever. But in the film as well, the SS actually just shoot 3 people straight out and then take hostages. In the book, they just take hostages. So in both, Camphor and Vermin hate each other, as Vermin won't join the Nazi party and despises the SS. Camphor obviously is quite high up in the SS. And in the book, we get a bit with the two men of the SS is killed, and Camphor understanding it is not a what, it's not a who, it's a what that is killing them, because the two men in the SS that are killed, then while they're dead, go into Camphor's room and drop dead on top of him. So he knows it's a what and not a who. But in the film, he never even agrees to it being a what at all, ever. It's not until sort of like just before he dies, basically. Sorry, spoiler alert. But in both, the writing on the wall causes the men at the keep to get the professor and his daughter to translate. So in the film, they're rescued from going into a camp and then they're transported across to Romania. In the book, they're still at home, but then they're transported across to Romania. Now, in the book, the men are dismantling the keep and find a host of old manuscripts are about evil and have been, over the years, destroyed. And they're sort of like the last remaining copies, some of which are more rumours than actual transcripts. But in both, the professor translates the words, which are telling basically the Germans to leave, get out, because they are disturbing someone in their home. Now, the first time the professor and Magda encounter the creature, in the book, it comes into the room, and as it's going to take Magda, the professor speaks to it in an old language. In the film, it stops Magda being assaulted, it brings her to the room and makes a deal with the professor and starts the process of making the professor look younger and healthier and removing this debilitating disease that he has out of his body. Now, in the book, it is Vermin who saves Magda from assault, from one of the many assaults that she almost ends up with. And that night, no one dies. So they think that obviously the professor is doing something right because the professor arrives and no one dies. In the film, the next day after, the two men who assaulted Magda were killed in the night, so she is then sent to the inn. In the book, she refuses to go, but the professor manipulates the situation by forcing Vermin to move her into the inn, by sending her across and knowing that it's going to cause disruption to the men. So in both now, Magda is now in the inn, but it's slightly different how she gets there. So in both, Glenn, the redhead man, almost gets stopped on the final leg of his journey to the keep. However, he bests the soldiers and moves on. He kills them in the book and he doesn't in the film, but it's fine. When Glenn arrives at the end, he's brash, he's loud, he's amused by Magda, but he's quite argumentative and loud. But in the film, he's more stoic and quiet, but he still has an affinity towards Magda. In both, something draws him to Magda. But in both, Magda and Glenn, they start a friendship of sorts, which develops into a relationship. And in both as well, the professor has struck a deal that he thinks the creature will then rid the world of Nazis. So again, he doesn't see anything wrong with what he's doing because the Nazis are ridding the world of him and his culture. Now, I've already said about the film, about the difference in the appearance, so I'm not going to say that again. In the book, there goes another night with no deaths, and in the book, Camphor is getting ready to leave. In the film, he doesn't have this notion to leave yet, as the deaths are still ongoing. And in the book, we find out that the creature is called, and we know that he knew Vlad Tepes. And again, in the book, when the professor first meets Glenn, he's quite cordial and quite likes him. But in the film, he doesn't really meet Glenn at any point, really, apart from when he gets told, when Glenn is like, oh no, he isn't who you think he is. This creature is out to manipulate you. Now, in the film, as I said, the first meeting doesn't go quite well with Glenn. And in the book, Magda goes back to the keep one night to help her father. In the film, she doesn't go back until the final confrontation. Now, in the book, the creature rescues Magda from assault and takes her to her father. In the film, the professor is completely won over by the creature and agrees to help release it from the keep. And in the book, you get a lot more history behind the creature, and he's talks with the professor as well as to who he is. And again, he's playing the long game. So he's pretending to be afraid of crosses. He pretends that he doesn't like the name Jesus, and so on and so forth. So now in the book, the professor and the creature strike a deal, and he makes the professor whole again. Whereas, as I said, in the film, he's already started making the professor whole again. But in both, the creature needs him to remove something from the keep and leave it outside the walls so it can leave, basically. And in both, Glenn and the professor have an argument over what helping the creature actually means. So in the village, there seems to be a feeling of anger and hate and violence that is sweeping from the keep, and this is in both. In the book, we see the creature twist the professor very expertly. In the film, it's not as obvious. It's more a case of, you know, the professor is quite happy to help straight away because he's feeling a lot better. In both, the professor tells Camphor that Glenn knows about the keep, so they go to get him from the inn and end up killing him. Well, killing him. So in the book, you get Vermin going to confirm his suspicion that there is dead moving, that the men who are dead are moving at night. So he comes across then the creature who destroys the cross he holds, kills him, and then he's hung as if he's committed suicide, which is not great, and it demoralizes the rest of the troops, but everyone dies that night anyway, so it's fine. In the film, the creature settles a fog on the keep and then slaughters all within it, apart from the professor. In the book, the creature brings the dead back to life, as it were, but only as killing machines. They kill the living then rise when they die, and so on until literally everybody is dead. Again, the professor doesn't die. In both, Glenn is still alive and heals himself for the final battle. In both, the professor is tasked with removing the talisman. In the book, however, Glenn gives Magda the history of the keep and the creature and who he is. We don't really see that in the film. We know it must have happened, but we don't really see it in the film. Now, a fight breaks out between Magda and her father in both, and he finally understands that the creature is evil. And he basically turns around to the creature and says, if this is your talisman, if this is your thing, you remove it from the keep. So then Glenn arrives in both and connects the talisman with his blade for the final battle, and in both Glenn defeats the creature. Now the film ends with Glenn being killed with the creature and Magda and her dad leaving the keep. However, in the book, ends with Magda and Glenn having a life together because her dad had passed away, and Glenn is now finally free of having to destroy the creature. Surprisingly, this film is a lot closer to the book than I first assumed. Now, obviously, the creature is completely different in appearance and in history, and we do not get the reanimated corpses. As I said, it's a film of the 80s, and their special effects person unfortunately passed away, so it would have been interesting to see if they would have included that. As mentioned before, there were problems with the film and the fact that there was studio interference, so I think there might have been a bit more sort of like between the characters, as it were, and a bit more character development in the film. But overall, it gets a 5 out of 10 from me because it is pretty close and it keeps most of it pretty much the same. Now, obviously, this is my own opinion. If you agree or disagree with anything that I've said, please do leave it below in the comments. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to my channel so you're alerted when the next video comes out. If you've got any book to film recommendations, please, again, leave it below in the comments, or join in my Facebook group on the Contented Narrative on Facebook or the Contented Narrative on Instagram and let me know your thoughts. I do eventually get round to them. You know, he's only been asking for this for like a year, but I do eventually get round to them. But thank you so much for watching, guys, and have a great day and keep it contento.